Glenn. Thanks for the invitation here. I've always admired the Washington Legal Foundation as one of the few right-wingers to survive 7 years at Yale in the 1970s. There weren't many of us there, and I graduated in 1977, just as you were getting started, so I'm delighted to help in any way that I can. As Glenn said, the handout I think we're making available today are some chapters of my book. I know you're dedicated to free enterprise, and I feel kind of guilty saying this. I don't earn any profits from the book. All the profits go to the nonprofit Virginia Law Foundation, and McGuire-Woods doesn't earn any profits either, but that's available from Virginia CLE. Glenn was nice enough to tell me this morning that a little link that from my bio page to my weekly privilege points, which I've done for about 350 Wednesdays in a row. In fact, maybe more than that now. But anyway, that's down. But if you want to sign up for my little 3-paragraph weekly blurbs that come out every Wednesday afternoon, you can normally do that by going to my bio page at the McGuire-Woods website. And with any luck, it'll be up and running soon. I'm going to talk about some of those privilege points here. And I hope that you ask me, just email Glenn or me if you have any questions about any new cases that I'm going to talk about today. I read all the important cases from every court on privilege every month. I used to read all of them, but that's a little bit too much now. But I'll be talking about cases that came out just within the last couple of weeks. And so if you have any questions about those aren't available anywhere yet. I mean, the cases are, but I won't give you the full sites. Just let me know or let Glenn know, and I'm happy to help you with that. And also, I'm happy to answer questions. If you have any questions afterwards, just send them to Glenn, and I'll be happy to answer them if I can. Just don't make them so specific that I have to run a conflicts check. Okay, we're going to talk about corporate investigations today. I'll talk for about 45 or 50 minutes, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. Let me give some preliminary issues, which may be the most important ones of all. The first one is, who is your client if you're conducting an investigation? And I'm going to talk a little bit about within the corporation itself, who is the client and who owns the privilege. And then most importantly, should you also represent any executives as part of an investigation? Some law firms have gotten in trouble for that if they intentionally jointly represent executives. And then if you accidentally create an attorney-client relationship with an executive, then you're really in trouble. And with apologies to Glenn, I'll talk a little bit about the general counsel of Penn State, who has had troubles with that as well. Sorry, Glenn. Okay, I'm also talking about whether the shareholders are really your client. And I'll talk about a Walmart investigation of corruption in Mexico, where Walmart found, to its surprise, I would think, that the real client was the shareholders of Walmart. Okay, first, within the corporation, normally the default rule, the default rule is that the corporation is the client. But it doesn't have to be the client. The client, when you're doing an investigation, can be an audit committee or special committee or even the outside directors that is a constituent of the client. There's 2 cases from 2008, one from the Northern District of California, one from Delaware State Court, where an audit committee or a special committee hired a law firm. One was Howry, one was Orrick Harrington, to investigate options backdating. They investigated that, and then they reported to the board of directors of the corporation, and they waived the privilege because the courts found that there was no common interest, believe it or not, between the audit committee and the board of directors of the corporation. And it seems obvious now, but those are fine law firms, but they didn't get it. What was happening is that they were investigating 2 of the directors themselves, and when they reported to the board, those directors being investigated were present with their own personal lawyers. Looking back at it, you might say, well, how could they have missed that? But as I say, these are great law firms, and they did miss it. So if you're going to represent the corporation, you've got to decide who you're going to report to. If you're going to represent just an audit committee, you've got to be careful that you don't blow the privilege by communicating outside that committee. Okay, but who owns the investigation report when you represent an audit committee or a special committee? There's a brand new case from the Southern District of New York of September of last year that deals with this. This is Judge Abrams in the Southern District of New York, who said that there was basically an uncertain law about that, but that was a question of Paul Weiss, who conducted an investigation for an audit committee of a company called China Medical. And then China Medical went into bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy trustee wanted Paul Weiss's files, and Paul Weiss resisted, saying you weren't the client. That is the company, now in the hands of the bankruptcy trustee. We represented the audit committee. And Judge Abrams goes through, he doesn't cite it, but there's an earlier case from Alabama Supreme Court in 2006 where Skadden Arps, in exactly the same situation, disclaimed an attorney-client relationship with the corporation in its retainer letter and was able to withhold its files from an investigation, from an audit committee representation, from the bankruptcy trustee. Judge Abrams of the Southern District last September said the audit committee was independent in some sense. It could retain counsel, legitimately expected its communications with counsel would be protected against intrusion by management. But bankruptcy changed everything, Judge Abrams said, because the liquidator has a duty to investigate, and letting the audit committee withhold information from the liquidator would thwart the statutory obligation of a trustee in bankruptcy to maximize the value of the estate by conducting investigations into a corporation's pre-bankruptcy affairs. So in that case, the audit committee was separate before bankruptcy, but after bankruptcy, the investigation files of Paul Weiss were turned over to the trustee. Interestingly, Paul Weiss was able to retain its work product and not turn that over, which is fascinating to me. The court didn't get into that other than at the very tail end. Now, sometimes disclaiming a representation of the company doesn't work. And again, I don't mean to pick on Pennsylvania here, Glenn, sorry, but K&L Gates conducted an investigation into possible misconduct by a CEO of a company called LeNature. And the rumor was, I guess, the worry was that he was a crook. K&L Gates exonerated him, but the company went into bankruptcy because he was a crook. And the bankruptcy trustee sued K&L Gates for malpractice, and K&L Gates defended, much like Skadden defended against the discovery of its files, saying we did not represent the corporation. In fact, we only represented the audit committee, the special committee. In fact, the K&L Gates retainer letter sounds great. Let me read it. We understand that we are being engaged to act as counsel with a special committee and for no other individual or entity, including the company. We further understand we are to assist the committee in investigating the facts and circumstances of this alleged crooked CEO. And they said actually the audit committee owns the privilege. They did everything right, but the trial court dismissed the malpractice case against K&L Gates, but the appellate court reversed on 3 grounds. One was that as a matter of law, even the audit committee owes a duty to the whole corporation, so you really can't disclaim a duty, and therefore you can commit malpractice and be sued by the corporation's successor, the bankruptcy liquidation trustee. The other thing K&L Gates did that the court pointed to was to share a draft of the report with the CEO it was investigating. And I don't know why they did that. That seems odd to me, but my guess would be, if I had to guess, because that's a great firm too, that they maybe showed the factual portion and said, tell us if you disagree with any facts. The other thing that the court really rubbed K&L Gates' nose in, and this is a mistake I would have made every time, is this, and this is a good example for all of us to keep your eye on the ball. When K&L Gates needed a forensic accountant to help investigate the CEO, this is what its retainer letter with the forensic accountant said. The forensic accountant shall provide general consulting, financial accounting, and investigative or other advice as requested by K&L to assist it in rendering legal advice to LeNature, the company, not the audit committee. And as I tell you, that's why we have paralegals, so we can blame them on everything. But that's a mistake I would have made every time. They picked an off-the-shelf retainer letter, and so the court said, well, wait a minute, you said right here who you're representing, so it's very clear who your client was. So first decide who your client is within the entity. Is it the audit committee? Is it the board? Is it the corporation? Okay. Should you also represent individuals intentionally? Probably not. Irell and Manella was reported to the bar by the Central District of California by jointly representing Broadcom and its CFO, again named Rule, with the Ninth Circuit reversed in 2009, but in a way that was very forgiving to Irell and Manella. What Irell and Manella did was represent them, Broadcom in a civil or criminal matter, Rule in a related matter, the same facts, options backdating, and then reported to the government about what it learned from Rule, its client. And the court, the Central District, was very critical, said it was an ethics violation. The Ninth Circuit gave him a break, but said you did not give proper upjohn warnings, which I'll get to in a minute. 2 lawyers from Stoll Reeves, the great Portland law firm, were exonerated by the Oregon Supreme Court just last year in a similar setting. And again, I think they really got a break because they represented a company and individual executives, and then later withdrew from representing the executives, continued to represent the company. I read the warnings that they gave about what that means, that they're going to be adverse to the executives. They didn't go real far, but the Oregon Supreme Court probably, out of deference to that great firm and the lawyers, one of whom went to Harvard, but nevertheless overcame that, and one went to Stanford, were really famous lawyers, and they got a break there. One of the other real obstacles we're going to have to see as it develops to representing executives in an investigation, which is always, the company always wants to do that because it's cheaper, and also you figure you want to keep them on the same team, is the Yates memo of last September 9th, where the government is now basically saying to corporations, we're not going to give you an easy time unless you give us an individual to be individually accountable for any wrongdoing. I've always thought that's one of the great ironies for the government to say that corporations should have individuals individually accountable. In the government, no one is ever individually accountable. You can do anything in the government, and the most that happens to you is you're put on administrative paid leave, which is like vacation. And I shouldn't give the government too much grief. Maybe I should, but I know it saved us in 2005. The government did, and I know it intrudes way too much, but it saved us from a horrible merger between Blockbuster Video and Hollywood Video, which in 2005 would have cornered the video market, and thank goodness that they stopped that one. So we're not compelled to buy videos from one of those two places. Anyway, so should you intentionally represent the individuals? Probably not. There's a frightening case from California State Court 2013 where a Union Pacific in-house lawyer represented a Union Pacific employee, not generally, but in a deposition. And a lot of us do this too, in-house lawyers and outside lawyers. I've never known what it means to say, I'll represent you for purposes of a deposition. I have no idea what that means. I've done it many, many, many times. Well, this fellow Plummer, who's an in-house lawyer at Union Pacific, represented a Union Pacific employee who witnessed an accident. And this is what the California Appellate Court said in 2013. Yanez, the individual Union Pacific employee, expressed concern about his job because his deposition testimony is likely to be unfavorable to Union Pacific, and asked Plummer, the in-house lawyer, who would represent him, who would protect him. The in-house lawyer responded, Yanez was a Union Pacific employee. Plummer was his attorney for the deposition, whatever that means. As long as Yanez told the truth, Yanez's job would not be affected. Well, you can see what happened here. He told the truth about the accident. He was fired because they didn't like his testimony, and he, the employee, sued the in-house lawyer for malpractice. And this appellate court in California allowed it to proceed. That's a frightening thought. Many of us don't realize that if we're representing somebody in the deposition, that they're a client and they can sue for malpractice, and that could end up hurting you if you intentionally represent anyone who's an executive or any other employee. And let's see, the other thing I want to mention is you can have an accidental creation of an attorney-client relationship. That's the scariest of all, when you don't make it clear who you are representing. That's, of course, the Upjohn warning. Upjohn has two halves, the Upjohn warning. The first half is ethics, the second half is privilege. The first half says, I don't represent you, I represent the company. And you've got to do that, or else you might accidentally create an attorney-client relationship. The second half of Upjohn, which I can talk about later if you want me to, is the privilege one. That is, why am I talking to you? I'm talking to you because you have facts that I need. And I'm going to use those facts to give advice to my client, who isn't you. And then traditionally, the Upjohn warning said, and by the way, keep it confidential. You don't talk about it because the privilege doesn't belong to you. And if you go spread it too widely within a corporation, it can be lost if it goes beyond a need to know. And I'm going to keep it confidential except reporting to my client. Let me take a second and talk about the privilege half, because there's something happened April 1st, ironically, last year, where the government strong-armed KBR, and this said basically, KBR, by giving the standard Upjohn warning we've used for decades, you have discouraged whistleblowing. And the government strong-armed KBR into paying a $130,000 fine and said, you have to go back and tell everybody you interviewed as part of an investigation that they are free, if they want to whistleblow on us. And you don't need anyone's permission to do that. I'm getting calls from general counsel of companies that are saying, we're getting calls from the government who wants to see our Upjohn warnings. So get ready for that as part of an investigation. I'd be surprised if many other companies weren't strong-armed in the same way. And the problem is this. The privilege is so fragile that if they do talk about it within the company, the privilege can be lost, and there's nothing the company can do about it. And so if you don't discourage people from talking about the investigation or the privileged communications, the companies are going to be whipsawed. They're going to get nailed by the government for trying to muzzle possible whistleblowers. If they don't tell people to keep it to themselves, they're going to lose the privilege, and then private plaintiffs or the government can come after that stuff. So that's the privilege part. Now, the first half of Upjohn, the ethics part, is really important because that prevents all the duties from attaching to the employee you're talking to. And I'll just dump a little bit on Penn State here, not on the institution, but in the Penn State example, as you know, Jerry Sandusky, just a monster of a guy, and you may wonder why the three executives, the former head of Penn State, the CFO, and the athletic director, assistant athletic director, haven't been tried yet. They were indicted for covering up the scandal. They haven't been tried because of an Upjohn problem. General counsel of Penn State, former Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice, and that court has had its own problems lately, Cynthia Baldwin, gave these three individuals the impression she was representing them. She went into the grand jury with them, which you can do in Pennsylvania, which is surprising to me. I don't do criminal law. And when they were asked, "Do you have a lawyer?" they said, "Yes, she's right here sitting with me, Cynthia Baldwin." She didn't speak up. Then afterwards, she said, "Oh, by the way, maybe I should have said something. I'm not your lawyer. When you're facing decades in prison and you thought you had a lawyer, sorry, you didn't have a lawyer. I'm actually representing Penn State." And then she testified to the grand jury against them. And that formed the basis of some of the criminal claims against them. Well, you can imagine their, not just embarrassment, their anger at thinking they were protected by a lawyer when they weren't protected by a lawyer because there was no valid, strong Upjohn warning. They tried to get the case dismissed, some of it, maybe all of it. The trial court said no. A remarkable opinion that said, who could possibly have imagined in a million years that there could be a difference in interest between the individuals accused of covering up Jerry Sandusky's sex abuse and the institution? I'm thinking the sun comes up in Pennsylvania, so yeah, it's very obvious that there could be a conflict. And in January of this year, the three appellate court decisions came out saying, dismissing the claims against, many of the claims against these three individuals because of the Cynthia Baldwin problem. Okay, and then the final thing, as I mentioned, that your client in some cases are the shareholders. There's a doctrine called the Garner Doctrine, when shareholders, if they meet a pretty strict standard, are entitled to communications between the management of the corporation and management's lawyers. Two unions suing Walmart got access to the investigation files of Walmart's investigation into Mexican corruption because they were considered the true clients, the corporation. Okay, some logistics about, and I know I spent a long time on that, but that's the key that a lot of people get off track right away. What logistics are there? It's important that you tell people how to write things down and not to jump to conclusions. That may be the best advice I can give anybody that's involved in this. I just read a case last week, March 29th of this year, in which the Western District of Louisiana held this, amazing. The in-house lawyer who represented a parent company and a subsidiary, and the parent was a defendant, was found to have waived the privilege by sending his legal memo to one employee of a direct subsidiary of his client, the parent, which is unbelievably wrong. And yet, that's going to be produced unless they go up on mandamus. And so you never know when a court's going to do something like that, to find that a parent and a sub do not have a common interest, and there's been a waiver by giving a privileged communication to one employee of a direct subsidiary. So you have to be careful to write things down, that don't jump to conclusions, don't guess, don't speculate, just use facts and so on. And there's other reasons for that too. The corporation could be bullied into waiving things, or things could be disclosed inadvertently, or they could be stolen and intentionally disclosed. Okay, two protections that you got to talk about, as Glenn said. The privilege is absolute, but it's very difficult to create, and it's really fragile. Martha Stewart lost the privilege by giving something to her own daughter. It's that fragile. The work product doctrine is much more robust. You can share it with your friends, but it's not absolute. It can be overcome. And then only if the other side really needs the investigation files, they will get them. If you interview somebody and the person disappears or gets run over by a bus, the other side will get your interview notes. They won't get your opinions. So you always want to consider both. You want to consider privilege because it's absolute. You want to consider work product because it can be shared more easily and it's not as fragile. What are the non-dispositive factors? The attorney's involvement is a factor, but it's not a dispositive factor. Half of these claims for privilege, and I read the investigation cases every month from every court I can find, half of them fail, maybe more than half of them fail. And they fail with big-time law firms that you've heard of asserting privilege and losing. I think that courts look at 3 phases of an investigation: the initiation, the course of it, and the use of it. Let's go to initiation about privilege. To be privileged, the primary purpose of the investigation has to be the company's need for legal advice. Now, there's a debate, which I hope spreads, of whether that's really the test. As Glenn said, the D.C. Circuit, in a case called Barco, although it's called about 3 different things, in 2014 found, I guess it was early 2015, no, D.C. in June 27, 2014, found that instead of the primary purpose test, we should use the one significant purpose test. And I know that sounds similar. It's not really similar. If it has to be the primary purpose is for legal advice, an investigation will hardly ever deserve privilege protection if it's required by some law or required by some internal requirement of the company. So it will not have much of a chance for that if it's the primary purpose test. If it's one significant purpose test is legal advice, then it might survive, the privilege might survive, even if the investigation is otherwise required. The Southern District of New York, as Glenn said, in January of last year, said that the D.C. Circuit's holding in this Barco case is consistent with, if not compelled, by Upjohn. And I keep hoping that this will spread, that is abandoning the primary purpose test, going with the one significant purpose test. But the Second Circuit last year, in an opinion by Judge Winter, who was the only right-thinking professor on the Yale faculty when I was there, said in his explanation, but it was a preliminary explanation, that to be privileged, the purpose of the communication must be solely for obtaining or providing legal advice, which is back from the primary purpose test. But that wasn't the focus of Judge Winter's opinion. So I think it's safe to assume it'll be the primary purpose test that applies, even though I'm hoping that the one significant purpose test spreads. Now, as we said earlier, if it's a normal compliance review or regular audit, not going to be privileged because it's not primarily for the purpose of legal advice. It's primarily for ordinary business things. Let me just give you some examples. This is from Eastern District, Louisiana, March of 2015. Dow does a root cause analysis, and there's an affidavit that says, I'm the lawyer, I oversaw this root cause analysis, and the court rejected the privilege for the investigation because it's a standard business review. And then the court says this, it basically rejects the affidavit of the in-house lawyer that says, this is something special, something different. The court said, wait a minute, this is the only root cause investigation you did as a result of that incident. And so you can't say it was special because you have to do them. You do them every time. And the anticipation litigation of the need for legal advice cannot change what you do every time into a privileged communication. Dow has failed to show that the report refers to legal rather than business or technical advice and recommendations, which is another thing to keep in mind, is that the courts read the investigation, the fruits of the investigation, the report of the investigation, and they look at it, and that's how judges make decisions. And the affidavit that a lawyer might say is, I did this for legal advice, if that doesn't match up with what the documents say, you're doomed. I just read a case last week, District of Minnesota, March 30th, involving Bracewell and Giuliani. Giuliani has now left Bracewell. But Bracewell and Giuliani is hired to conduct a review or an investigation, I guess it'd be called, a review of procedures for an insurance company. And there's an affidavit of the in-house lawyer say, we hired Bruce Bracewell and Giuliani because they've had experience with this. We need their legal advice. But the adversaries who successfully defeat the privilege claim point to emails like this. Now, keep in mind, these are business people writing about why they hired Bracewell. An outside firm, Bracewell & Giuliani, was hired to review our current procedures and provide recommendations to us on how to improve the detection and prevention of life insurance sales intended to be investor-owned. Another business executive's memo talks about them providing consulting advice. Bracewell & Giuliani recommendations, majority implemented from a business plan, was in a PowerPoint presentation. And then the judge read the report from Bracewell & Giuliani and said, no, there seemed to be mostly business investigations, business issues. So everybody's got to be on the same team on the initiation of it. Lawyers should be involved at the very start of it, and they should be involved all the way along with it. Some of them did it right. A fantastic case, if you want to protect it, involves In re Target, District of Minnesota, last October. In this case, Target had two entirely separate investigations. One run by Verizon, which was the business one, which said how this happened, what do we do mechanically to prevent it. Another one, I'll read this, Target established its own task force and engaged a separate team from Verizon to provide counsel with the necessary input, and that one was privileged and work product. So you may very well have to have parallel investigations. You don't want to do that every time. It's very expensive. But if you might want to do it because that's one way to increase the odds of it being privileged, because it's then separate or different, and it's not the ordinary course of business. It's primarily motivated by something other than business. Okay, let me just give you a little bit of the scorecard here, ones that didn't work. Holland and Knight in 2008. Let's see, Andrews Kurth in 2009, Wachtell Lipton in 2007, Gibson Dunn 2002. There's a whole series of privilege claims that failed because they could not prove that the investigation was initiated by the need for legal advice. So what's the best practices? Get a lawyer involved early. You've got to make sure everybody's on the same page. A lot of times the business people won't want to talk publicly or even in emails about why they hired the lawyer. They should all say, we're hired the lawyer because we need legal advice. And you've got to show it's different or special, for sure. Okay, work product initiation. It's the same primary purpose test, but it's got to be a different purpose. To be protected by the work product doctrine, and more of these are work product kind of cases, it's got to be motivated by litigation. Now, you need three things for work product. You need litigation, anticipation, and motivation. It's the last one that's the most important that most lawyers don't think of. First, you need litigation. It's important to realize that a government investigation is not litigation. Now, you can look through the government investigation and say this government investigation is so ugly that we anticipate being sued. In other words, you can say we're going to be sued later, but because you're going to be investigated, or the investigation itself is not litigation. You then need anticipation, and there's you don't know what the spectrum is. Well, I know what the spectrum is. It's everything from imminent in some courts to some possibility. There's no choice of laws issues with work products, so you're not going to know what standard applies, but there's nothing you can do about that. There is a huge risk, though, and keep this in mind, because this is playing out in the Eastern District of Virginia, where I practice, of claiming work product when you don't do what else is required when you do anticipate litigation. And I've worried about this for many years. It's something that seems obvious, and yet a lot of people have missed it. I would have missed it too. But when you anticipate litigation, you need a mental state that says, I think I'm going to get sued, either imminent or some possibility. Keep in mind what else comes with that mental state. The requirement to preserve pertinent documents comes with that mental state. There's no O'Melveny and Myers privilege log case from 2005 that I've been scared about for now over 10 years, where the court looked at the O'Melveny and Myers privilege log to see the earliest date they claimed work product and said, did you start saving the documents as of that date? It really hit the big time when the Federal Circuit in 2014 upheld a $16 million verdict against a company called Glenmark Pharmaceuticals. They'd given an adverse inference to the jury saying you can assume Glenmark destroyed documents that hurt it. And it was looking at the privilege log, the earliest date it claimed privilege, work product protection. There's not much of a risk in claiming privilege. You might lose it. Huge risk in claiming work product if you're not preserving the documents. It's playing out now in a case involving Starbucks. Starbucks is in litigation with the supplier chairs. And Starbucks said 7,000, maybe they're not claiming all 7,000, but thousands of chairs are defective, either by design or manufacture. A company called Kettler made the chairs. Well, Starbucks tested the chairs and claimed work product for its testing of the chairs, its investigation into it, but didn't preserve the chairs. And so the Eastern District of Virginia last April, just about a year ago, said, hey, Starbucks, I'm going to let you claim damages for the chairs you still have, which is 200 chairs. So don't expect damages for thousands. You're going to get it for 200 if you win. Okay, so that's the anticipation, but motivation is the real key. You need something special or different, and it's impossible for me to overemphasize how important this is. If something is required by the government, it will not generally be work product because it's not motivated by the litigation. If it's required by some internal requirement, it's not likely to be work product because it's not motivated by the litigation. I will read a quote here now, a question from Judge Gorenstein in a case called Bank of China. Now, the Second Circuit criticizes this a little bit in Judge Winter's opinion I mentioned, but Bank of China investigated possible ties to terrorism. And did they anticipate litigation? Of course they did. But let me read the question that Judge Gorenstein asked in this case involving Bank of China, Southern District of New York. The question is a factual one. Would Bank of China have generated the materials listed in that privilege log in a similar form had it not anticipated litigation? Answering this question requires us to consider what would have happened had there been no litigation threat. That is, whether Bank of China would have generated these documents if it was acting solely for non-litigation purposes. And the answer was, of course they would have. And so they didn't do anything special because they anticipated litigation. There's other more recent cases. September 2015, someone dies, a minor dies in someone's custody, and the Kansas Department of Children and Families investigates it and says no privilege, no work product, because right here in your manual it says you investigate all child's death. Same with Eastern District of Missouri. 2 days later, said, I see right here in your compliance manual, you've got to do these investigations. So obviously it's not motivated by the litigation. It's motivated by the requirement to investigate it. Let me just give you some other examples. This one involves Syracuse University, so I'll make fun of them for a minute here. You'll be happy with that. Remember when they had their own sex scandal? A basketball coach allegedly was abusing boys. He was exonerated. His wife sues ESPN and seeks documents from Syracuse University. Well, Syracuse had investigated itself, and you might think, oh my gosh, how could they possibly not be work products? Penn State's example, and the court says this, the Northern District of New York says not work product. Even where a party clearly anticipated litigation at the time a document was created, the party asserting privilege still bears the burden of showing the document would have been produced in similar form absent anticipated litigation. While the Jones affidavit, these are all affidavits the courts reject, state that the university anticipated litigation at the time of the investigation and offers no evidence that the documents produced during the investigation would not have been prepared in the same form absent the prospect of it. So what else? What do you have to do? You have to prove something special or different. Another Northern District of California case, 2014, shows how counterintuitive this is. There was a job-related injury. There was an internal incident investigation report, and in an affidavit, the court says, no, it's work product because we gave it to the lawyer. And we only give it to the lawyer when there's going to be litigation. And the court said that hurt the work product claim. It actually reveals that these reports are created in substantially the same form regardless of the specific threat of litigation, and the reports are only sent to outside counsel if litigation actually becomes likely. Notice how counterintuitive that is. You have to remember the document has to be different or special because of the litigation. Let me just give you one other example, another Eastern District, Louisiana case, Chevron. They have a legally chartered root cause investigation because somebody was hurt in a pipeline explosion. But they lose the work product claim, Chevron does, because somebody in the deposition agreed that the primary purpose is to prevent a similar accident from happening in the future. And then Chevron's pipeline president says this in a newsletter. We are conducting root cause analyses of these incidents. We'll apply lessons learned. Our ultimate goal remains the same, an incident and injury-free workplace. So everybody's got to be on the same page or else they're going to lose the work product claim. Again, there may have to be a parallel or successive investigation. Something's got to be different or special. The court will read the investigation report. I won't take time to go through the scorecard. More big firms have lost the work product claim than they've lost the privilege claim. Okay, I've talked about the initiation. That's the most important part, but let me back up and do a little bit about the course of the investigation. The course of the investigation is the lawyer's involvement. The district D.C. court here in 2012 said, for the results of an internal investigation to enjoy the attorney-client privilege, the company must clearly structure the investigation as one seeking legal advice and must ensure that attorneys themselves conduct or supervise the inquiries, and at the very least, the company must make clear to the communicating employees the information will be transmitted. That's the Upjohn standard. So you've got to set it up so that the lawyers are involved, and the more the lawyers are involved, the more likely it is to be privileged. And the courts, again, will read the documents. So the more the lawyers are involved on the privilege side, in fact, it's necessary for them to be involved on the privilege side, the more likely it is to be protected. On the work product side, let me mention one more thing about the course of the investigation. It's not likely that the lawyers will rely on client agents. These are outsiders, and I'll just spend a few minutes on outsiders. Remember I showed how fragile the privilege is, that Martha Stewart gave something to her daughter and lost the privilege. Dealing with outsiders as part of an investigation can be a death to the privilege, unless the lawyer needs the information to give legal advice. Let me go back to that Syracuse one. In this case, Debevoise Plimpton, a super law firm, investigated the allegations, and they represented Syracuse. The coaches, the exonerated coach's wife, sought their documents. And she said, I see you have a public relations person helping you, Debevoise, and I want your communications with them because giving it to them waived the privilege. Would not waive work product, but they said it waived the privilege. Now, Debevoise had an affidavit that said, no, the PR firm aided Debevoise attorneys in providing legal advice to the university on issues of communication and publicity, conferred frequently with Debevoise and prepared drafts of press releases and other materials which incorporated the lawyer's advice. You'd think that's a winner? I mean, Debevoise's affidavit said we needed them. It lost. Northern District of New York. If a public relations support is merely helpful but not necessary to the provision of legal advice, no privilege. And then what did the court do? The court read the documents. And the court said, I found most of them did not contain communications relating to obtaining legal advice. So Debevoise, claiming work product, lost the work product protection. There's plenty of other, and I'm reading mostly from these privilege points that I've done. These are the kind of cases that I discuss with them. There's other cases I could read. Western District of Wisconsin, a regulatory compliance company. The lawyer hired the compliance company but didn't supervise it day to day and lost the privilege. Greenberg Traurig needed PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, to help it conduct an audit of royalty payments. And you might say, well, they got to get it right. Let me read their retainer letter. PwC agreed to perform services intended to assist counsel with his provision of legal advice. The District of Massachusetts rejected the work product claim. Neither the retainer letter nor any other evidence set forth in the record suggested that PwC was necessary or at least highly useful in facilitating the legal advice, or that Greenberg Traurig was relying on PwC to translate or interpret information between the lawyers and the clients. So involving outsiders can doom the privilege. You're going to have to show that they are necessary and they're essentially providing translation or interpreting advice if you're in the Southern District of New York. And other courts are not quite as narrow as that, but nearly as narrow. Now, client agents, that is not the ones helping the lawyer, the ones helping the client, like a PR agency the client hires or an environmental consultant, they are almost always outside privilege protection. And so what you've got to do is to train your business clients, the corporate clients you represent, not to do what would be intuitive to them, to share your advice with these other people that are helping the company. They assume, business people assume, justifiably, I think, that the confidentiality agreement that they have with people that are helping them will allow them to share privileged communications with them without blowing the privilege. It doesn't. The privilege is so fragile that even a confidentiality agreement does not prevent waiver of the privilege which lets anyone else in the world get it. Martha Stewart giving it to her daughter. The daughter's not going to give it to the federales, and yet that was a waiver of the privilege. It wasn't a waiver of work product, and so the government didn't give it, but luckily they claimed work product and privilege. Okay, the course of the work on the work product side, anybody can create work product. You don't have to be a lawyer to create work product. A lot of courts don't get that, but a lawyer's involvement on the work product side is really important. First, because some judges don't get it, but mostly because it shows it's something different or special. We don't always get a lawyer involved, but we did this time. Okay, let me just quickly go through the use of it, and then I'll take questions in another few minutes. We talked about initiation. That's the key. Lawyers should be involved immediately, because if the client has already started the investigation before they bring the lawyers in, how do you ever prove the primary purpose of it was to get legal advice or for anticipated litigation? You can't, because it started, and the lawyer can't run to the head of the parade and say, well, it morphed. And they can try the morphing argument. It usually doesn't work. So the lawyers should be at the very beginning of the process, not only brought in at the end of the process. Okay, then we talked about the course of it. The more the lawyers are involved, the better shot you have at privilege and at work product as well. Now, what about the use of it? If the company uses the investigation results for business purposes, much like that one of Bracewell and Giuliani, you're not going to win the privilege fight because the use of it demonstrates the primary purpose of it. You can also share with others the privileged reports and so on, and that can be a waiver. I'll get to that. Privilege is so fragile, showing basically anyone waives the privilege. I'm going to talk about waiver more extensively when I get to work product. Okay, the use of work product. That you're usually not going to use the results of an investigation if it's litigation related for business purposes. But you've got to prove from the very beginning that what initiated the work product protected investigation was not business purposes. You have a separate one for that if you want to be extra careful. But have one that's devoted to litigation preparation. That's for work product. But it's very likely that you may want to share investigation that is protected by work product with others. Like I said, it's not as fragile as the privilege, and so you can share work product with your friends. You can share it with the PR agency. You can share it with your auditors. You can share it with others, but you can't share it with the government, except in very rare circumstances. The government is almost always the enemy because unless at very rare circumstances where you are assisting the government in pursuing some wrongdoing, you might have a shot at claiming the government is really your friend, but the government normally is not your friend. So what do you do if you want to impress the government? Well, what you can do with the government is to share facts with the government. Facts are never privileged. They're never protected by the work product doctrine. Something either happened or it didn't happen. And there's two great cases from Judge Francis of the Southern District of New York. I think they may be too new to be in my book, frankly, but I can give them to you. Latham and Watkins and Davis Polk conducted two separate corporate investigations into a company called Weatherford International Securities Litigation, or Weatherford International Securities, material weaknesses in that company's internal control. So two separate investigations, Latham and Watkins, Davis Polk. They then report to the SEC, and Judge Francis, who is the superstar of the Southern District on privilege, has to decide whether they've waived the privilege and allowed the private plaintiffs suing Weatherford to get those. And the court says this, that you can present facts to the government, historical facts, without waiving anything. If somebody traveled to Brazil and brought back a pile of money and deposited it at some bank in New York, that's a fact. It's one thing just to tell the government that, but that's different from giving the government your report that includes that fact. So Judge Francis had to go and take two bites at the apple at this, but he said if Latham, Watkins, and Davis Polk gave any documents to the SEC, they waived it. Any oral statements to the SEC were fair game. And then if the underlying factual material explicitly referenced in documents or statements, Davis Polk and Latham had to give that up. And then they had to come back again because they couldn't decide, the plaintiffs and those two law firms couldn't agree on what he meant by that. So in a second opinion, he said you don't have to produce any of the underlying factual material unless there is a specific explicit identification, citation, or quotation in information disclosed to the SEC. So if you're careful, if you're careful when you go to the government and you want to get some benefit from the government and get the government off your back, you can, if you make it a purely factual recitation, then you will not expressly waive the privilege because you're just presenting historical facts, not your analysis. But if you quote an employee, for instance, that's going to be a communication that is waiving the privilege because if it's a privileged event that is communicating under Upjohn, because then you're disclosing the content of it. But there's ways to structure it, and Judge Francis gives you the roadmap for those in those two Southern District of New York cases of going to the government with the results of an investigation. One more point, then I'll get to best practices and open it up for questions. There's a whole other way you can waive the privilege, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Express waiver occurs when you actually disclose privileged communications. There's an implied waiver that occurs when you rely on the fact of the communication without disclosing it. And if you were to go to the government, for instance, and say, back off, government, we had some law firm investigate this and they said it was okay, or even if you said, we investigated it and we didn't report anything, and we always report things if they find something. That happened in the Barco case, actually. I think it was in the Barco case. But, we had somebody investigated, they didn't do any report. If you refer to the investigation and rely on its existence without even disclosing anything from it, you can impliedly waive the privilege because you're trying to gain some advantage by the fact of the investigation, and that's called an implied waiver. At the far end of an implied waiver is what's called the at-issue doctrine. The at-issue doctrine occurs without even mentioning a lawyer, without disclosing anything, but putting at issue your mental state. And that often happens in not so much in investigation context, but in a case, for instance, if you're claiming good faith reliance on your interpretation of a regulation, for instance. If you say, well, we thought we were doing the right thing and interpreting the regulation a certain way, and a lawyer helped you understand the regulation, you're going to be hard-pressed to withhold that. Let me just mention the Southern District of New York case, which seems wrong to me, frankly. It just was decided March 11th of this year, and I'm going to do a privilege point about it. In fact, I just dictated it yesterday. This is the situation, because the Southern District takes a very narrow view of the at-issue doctrine. A plaintiff misses the statute of limitations and relies on the discovery rule. Says that we didn't even know that we were injured. The statute didn't start running till later. They withhold documents. Their privilege log describes one of the documents as, this is the subject, to litigate or not to litigate, that is the question. And the defendant says, well, wait a minute, we got to see those. You claiming you didn't know you were injured and you've got this on your privilege log from the critical time? The Southern, now intuitively you think, yeah, you got to cough that up. The Southern District denied discovery, which is fascinating to me. And so they will get away, the plaintiff will get away with claiming ignorance despite withholding documents that on their face seem to show that they weren't ignorant of it. Most courts would be broader in the at-issue doctrine, but that's another way that you can, as a result of an investigation, get in trouble by waiving the privilege even if you don't disclose it. Okay, best practices, then I'll shut up here. First, involve lawyers immediately. The primary purpose for privilege has to be getting legal advice, and so there should be an exchange of communications with the lawyer. I need legal advice, I need facts. Okay, we'll get the facts for you. Primary purpose for the work product has to be anticipated litigation. It may be too late, like I said, if the company starts the investigation with a primarily business purpose or in the ordinary course of its business or as a requirement of the government or an internal requirement. It's much less likely you're going to win a privilege or a work product fight because it's not motivated by the need for legal advice. You started it already without even being a lawyer involved. And you also started it without anticipating litigation. And even if you did anticipate litigation, you would have done anyway. So having a parallel or successive investigations is expensive, but if it's like Target found, it worked beautifully in the Target case. That's the model. Have two separate teams of forensic people helping out. You have a shot at that. And the four corners of every document, the face of every document, from the very beginning all the way through it, should demonstrate that it was the primary purpose, that the lawyer was involved, and the court will read those, and the report all the way from the beginning of the initiating documents, like in the Bracewell and Giuliani case, why they brought the law firm in, to the report in the Bracewell and Giuliani case, and the court said, this isn't primarily for legal advice. Make sure that every document supports that argument. And then let me close with the best advice I can give you is to make sure you're careful. Everybody's careful when they write. You obviously don't want to lie about anything, but you don't want to jump to conclusions or make some joke that will seem funny at the time, but not later on, because you'll suffer the consequences of that. Okay, let me take a breath. Glenn, turn it over to you if there's any questions. I hope there are, and if there aren't now, if there are later, I'll just take them later.
Thank you, Tom. Again, the email address to send in questions is interactive@wlf.org. I will start the questions off by asking Tom, some years ago there was a serious concern in the business community and the legal community about the government giving credit for companies waiving the privilege, and that has calmed down since memos were put out from the Justice Department saying that it shouldn't be a factor in it. Is that still a concern? Do you still feel pressure when you're working with companies to waive the privilege? And sort of as a second part of that question, what sort of factors do you weigh with your clients when they're considering whether or not to waive the privilege and disclose documents?
Well, let me go back. I come at this from a right-wing perspective, and Jim Comey was one of my partners, and I've heard him talk several times at that time about the government was looking for facts, which are never privileged. And I thought this was more of an attack on the Bush administration, this whole worry that the government was going to bully people into giving stuff up. The government wanted facts. And again, if you give facts to the government, you're not waiving the privilege. The Yates memo is basically the same thing, only worse in a way, because they want some individual scalp to hang on the wall. And so that creates more problems in some ways because it's a representation issue. Everybody's got to give their own lawyer now. So is it a problem? Yeah, the government's always going to bully corporations. That's just what they do. And so I would worry about it. What I think a lot of companies do is agonize over whether to try to get the government to back off by whether they should waive their privilege. They don't have to waive the privilege. If the government's acting in good faith, the government just wants the facts. And if you go to the government, as the Latham and the other law firm did in the Southern District case, and give them just the facts, you're not going to be waiving anything. So if you structure it the right way, you make it the benefit of a good faith prosecutors backing away without paying a waiver price.
Could you talk a little bit about the so-called fiduciary exception? There's been decisions from the Delaware Supreme Court on that in the case of a Walmart case, and then a decision from the New York Appellate Division involving NAMA Holdings versus Greenberg Traurig.
Right. The Greenberg Traurig case came out the right way, but the fiduciary exception comes from two strains of jurisprudence. One is old English trust law, where the trustee's lawyer was deemed to not represent the trustee, but to represent the beneficiary of the trust. That still applies in the case of ERISA situations, where an ERISA beneficiary will always get access to communications between the administrator and the administrator's lawyer about the administration of the plan, if it's a fiduciary function. The creation of the plan, not fiduciary function. Termination, not a fiduciary function. But the true client of the ERISA administrator's lawyer is the beneficiary of the plan. Joining that jurisprudence was the derivative cases in the U.S. where shareholders step into the shoes of management in a way, and if they meet these very onerous requirements under what's called the Garner Doctrine, they can get access to communications between management and management's lawyers, that is the company's lawyers, and that's what they did with Walmart. The Walmart case was a good example of how Walmart did everything exactly right. They could withhold it from non-clients, but the unions, who were shareholders of Walmart, were deemed to be the clients because they satisfied the Garner Doctrine. There's nothing you can do about that by operation of law. Greenberg Traurig was able to withhold stuff, even though the court in New York articulated the Garner Doctrine. But it's a good lesson for us because just be careful what you write, because even if you do everything right, the shareholders who are adversarial in a sense may get access to the stuff.
The most recent paper that I had mentioned at the outset that you wrote for us was on the GM decision from the Southern District of New York, and in it you talk about the concerns of courts going sort of document by document to determine whether there's a crime fraud exception issue there, and how do you manage that as a lawyer who's advising a client on those sort of issues, and is there a concern that the court might just sort of do a blunderbuss approach and deem it all to be crime fraud.
Maybe so. That's a good point, Glenn. A lot of non-litigators don't remember, or some litigators even don't remember how this all plays out in the real world. A lot of us talk about the abstract legal principles. The way it plays out in the real world is your company will be sued. Your lawyers will withhold documents. In the old days, that was it. We all trusted each other to withhold only the documents that should be withheld. Not anymore. Now you have to list the documents, and you have to describe who sent them, who received them, a little bit of subject matter about it, but that doesn't help discuss the content of it. The reason why this client-lawyer agent is so important, and the risk of sending it to a client agent, is those people show up as getting a copy. And so the face of the privilege log will let the corporation's adversaries say, aha, gotcha, can't be privileged, you've waived it. There's a lot of case law when an employee sends an email to another employee and there's no lawyer in the privilege log. And that can be privileged if somebody's passing along legal advice and so on. So the courts actually have to read the stuff. Some human being has to read it. And when I talk to in-house lawyers or lawyers anywhere, I say, how many of you have done privilege logs? And they all raise their hand. We've all done it if we're in our world. We hate it. Nobody likes it. It's horrible. And that's when you, working for the company as a young associate, can call somebody and say, why in the hell did you send this document? Who is this person? Who is that person? The judge doesn't have that luxury. The judge is going to sit there. The judge thinks they're overworked, underpaid. They don't have any help. They have to read these documents. They're not getting paid by the hour like the privilege reviewers. They can't call somebody to find out. So what's going on? So they look at the face of the document. And many courts will say, this is usually in the ordinary course of business, will say, I don't see a request for legal advice in here. And you can say, well, as an affidavit, as a company, I was an in-house lawyer, said they sent that to me so I could give legal advice. If you didn't answer it with legal advice, it's not going to help you much. And so you got to train, this is ordinary course stuff, day to day. Train your clients to ask for the legal advice. And when you give legal advice back, make sure that it's legal advice, not business advice. So that's a long way of saying that the courts look at this stuff. The crime fraud exception, I do worry, Glenn, like you say, the judge going to hate doing privilege reviews. Will just say, oh, it's all crime fraud. And that's why the GM Ignition case is great, because the judge said, we're not going to cast a broad net. We're going to look at every document to see if it furthered the fraud. And there's been another case since then, I can't remember who issued it, saying the same thing. So I know Judge Thornburg wrote a really well-known Washington Legal Foundation monograph on the crime fraud exception, worried about it swallowing up the whole privilege law. It hasn't yet, which is great. I thought it would too. In my book, there's a whole little section about this could be horrible because the criminalization of American conduct. Everything becomes criminal now. It's incredible to me. And the government's just heavy hand wants to be able to bully people. And so if the crime fraud exception expanded with that, we'd all be in trouble. The good news is that the courts are holding firm so far. The Southern District case is great, that if there's a crime or fraud, that's not enough to sweep away the privilege. It's got to further the crime or fraud. And so that was a good development, but it's a good lesson, too, that you better make sure the documents support your legal theory.
You talked quite a bit about third parties and how their involvement can complicate some of the privileged situations. How about a situation where a lawyer doing an internal investigation for a company goes and interviews a former employee? Are there issues there?
Yes, great question. Former employees, and I can come back and talk about all this stuff if you want, but once the court abandoned the control group standard, which was the old standard. The old standard was the only people who could have a privileged conversation with the corporation's lawyer were the management who acted on the advice. That is still the rule in Illinois. That's emphasizing the wrong information flow. The privilege exists so clients come to us, not so we go to our client. And Judge Rehnquist, Justice Rehnquist, not yet Chief Justice, in Upjohn, got it right. Said the privilege exists from Roman times so clients will feel safe coming to us. So don't look at who in the company acts on the legal advice. Look at who has the facts within the company, regardless of their place in the hierarchy. Once you abandon the hierarchical test, it was very easy for the courts to do two things, both of which are great for companies. One is that former employees have facts from when they were there, and you can have a privileged conversation with a former employee. The Business Court in North Carolina wrote a great opinion, though, which is a good warning for all of us. Because those of us as lawyers sit down with former employees, we can't treat them like current employees. In that case, in fact, it's a good lesson for two reasons, and I can give you the case if you want to see it. One is they said, you know what, when you ask what they did at the company, that's privileged. But then you said, what do you think, who should win this fight about the contract's meaning? That's not privileged. That's their opinion now. Or let me tell you what happened after you left the company, not privileged. And what the court then said at the end of this opinion in North Carolina was, you know what, you could have claimed work product for that conversation, but you didn't do it. And so it's a good lesson. Always look at both protections. So former employees within the privilege, as long as you limit it to what they did when they're at the company. The other thing they did, which is great for companies, there was a wonderful case called In re Beater, where somebody was an employee, but a week before they were outsourced. They hadn't yet been hired, but they were at the company full time, paid by somebody else. And the court created what's called the functional equivalent doctrine, which we would have to have this, because there's so many outsourcing going on that if somebody shows up, parks in the parking lot, has the phone number, but is paid by Kelly Temps or something, those people are also inside the privilege now. And just about every court follows what's called the functional equivalent doctrine.
Tom, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Mark Chenoweth, General Counsel here at WLF. What mistake do you see companies make most often that results in waiver of privilege in the course of an investigation?
I think there's the mistakes. The greatest mistake they make, I think, is in involving their agents in the investigation or sharing results with their agents. Like I said before, they understandably think that they've got this team of people looking at a problem. They have their PR people, they have their lawyer, they have their environmental consultant if it's an explosion or some groundwater leak. They think that the confidentiality, either understanding or agreements they have, will prevent a privilege waiver, and it doesn't. So that's their great, I think, companies' greatest mistakes in assuming that those people are within the privilege. And there's case after case where the PR people are considered outside the privilege. They're inside work product, which is good. Our greatest mistake as lawyers is to be so arrogant that we think if we hire the agent, they're automatically within the privilege, and they're often not. Think of Greenberg Traurig. And then the common interest doctrine is another area where we, as so arrogant as lawyers, think we can contract into avoiding a waiver, and we can't. Half of them fail.
Well, that was actually my second question was, you mentioned the common interest privilege in the context of the Western District of Louisiana case, that you couldn't even share something with a direct subsidiary of the company without waiving the privilege. So does the common interest privilege even exist?
It exists, yes, it does. And it exists when it works well, it works beautifully. Let me give an example of when it worked exactly right. When Taco Bell was sued, and everybody involved in Taco Bell was sued when people got sick, the plaintiff sued the lettuce supplier and the lettuce distributor, among everybody else. They then sued each other and said if it was the lettuce, you gave us lousy lettuce. No, it was the lettuce, you let it sit too long and it got bad. But they shared a common interest in saying it wasn't the lettuce that got everybody sick, it was the meat, if it was actually meat. So they could have a common interest agreement once they're in litigation, cooperating on a common legal strategy. That works perfectly. But the problem is that with the common interest doctrine, first, you're going to enter into it and then immediately share privileged stuff. So if it doesn't work, and half of them don't, you've already blown the privilege. Probably not a subject matter waiver, but you've blown it. The other problem is you don't know where you're going to get sued. And the courts disagree. They're all over the map on whether it has to be a unique interest. How does it have to be? Does it have to be identical, I should say, as opposed to a similar interest? Texas courts require there to be actual ongoing litigation, not anticipation. Same with Hawaii. If you get sued in one of those states, you're screwed unless you're actually in litigation. And there's such mischief that can come. I think in the Western District, think about this. The court said there was no common interest between the parent and the direct subsidiary, and because they weren't both going to be sued. That was what I call the weakest link thing. Every participant has to anticipate litigation. And then the judge did something that's remarkable. He quoted the plaintiff's lawyer as saying, I'm not going to sue the sub. And the court said, well, see, you didn't anticipate litigation. The plaintiff's lawyer said he wasn't going to sue you. Now think what mischief that could bring. You threaten a number of clients, number of companies, then you don't sue one of them, and bingo, it's a waiver. And that's even before the direct subsidiary issue. There's also a lot of debate. It's got to be common legal interest. I just did a privilege point a while ago where two courts within a month of each other take different positions on this issue. I'm probably going too long here, Glenn, but there's a patent owner and then somebody's going to get royalty of the patent. They often enter into common interest agreements to try to support the patent because the royalty owner is going to get money if the patent is valid. Well, one court said, of course that's a common legal interest. Another court said, no, it's a financial interest. No common interest. No common legal interest. And so there's so much uncertainty about that. The only way you can really feel safe with a common interest agreement, I think, is if you're in litigation or you're right on the verge of litigation and your interests are exactly aligned. The problem is that we as lawyers think that we can just contract into a protection, and you can't contract into it. And as I say, I read all the ones I can find because our clients in McGuire Woods use them all the time. What we often don't explore is a joint representation, which will cinch the privilege, but it will create conflicts problems. And if there's more than one company involved, neither one of their lawyers wants to give up the chance to represent them all the way through by risking a conflict. But if they could if the same lawyer represented all of the people, even if they're not in litigation, bingo, you automatically get the privilege because they're all your clients. But I think our worry about conflict scares us away from that.
One last question for you. You had mentioned Judge Francis as a superstar and privilege. What are there sort of common factors in judges' backgrounds that make them better or more understanding on privilege issues than others? For instance, somebody who's worked as an in-house counsel or a lawyer in a law firm versus someone who's an academic that might think that more information out there in the public eye is more in the public interest than companies' ability to make sure that they're in compliance with the law.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that, frankly. I do know that academicians have an ivory tower-ish understanding of the privilege. Let me give an example right here from D.C. There's a doctrine, and this is going to dump on academicians, not judges, because I may look stupid, but I'm not. The Vioxx, there's what's called the Vioxx doctrine, where a widespread circulation, even within the company, is deemed to prove that the communication was primarily business, not primarily legal, and therefore not privileged. The Vioxx, the judge handling the Vioxx MDL down in Louisiana screwed up a privilege law. He did it himself. I just feel sorry for it. There was some documents that ended up on both privileged and non-privileged lists. The Fifth Circuit said get some help. He hired Paul Rice, who was a super professor, the late Paul Rice, right here from D.C. And Paul Rice brought an academician's approach. This is what he said. He said, when a document is simultaneously sent, well, let me give it the background. The FTC would ask Vioxx a question, or Merck a question about Vioxx. Somebody would draft a response, then send the draft to 3 or 4 people or more within Merck, never went outside Merck, and said, what do you think of this response? One of them was a lawyer, and Paul Rice said, by definition, almost by definition, the document that went to all these people wasn't primarily asking for legal advice because it went to all the other people too. And of course, the in-house lawyer did what all of us would do, hit reply to all in responding. And he said, oh, well, gosh, that's not privileged either because it went to the people that didn't need the legal advice. So there's two doctrines. There's the widespread circulation going to the characterization of it as business or legal. And then there's the need-to-know standard, which is equally ridiculous, that said if you share a privileged communication within the company with a few extra people that didn't need to know it, the people suing the company get the document. That doesn't make any sense at all. Both of them are academicians created, but the courts follow them. And when I talk to judges as politely as and I'll give you one other story if I can. When the judges give the enemies of the corporation these documents because a few extra people within the company, each of whom has a duty of confidentiality, got it, I say, that doesn't make any sense at all. The other thing judges do, which doesn't make any sense, and this, I think the electronic communication revolution is changing this, they will sometimes say that if the final version of a document is going to be disclosed to the public or to any third party, the drafts of it are not protected either. And that comes from a doctrine that says that the privilege evaporates the moment the client forms the intent to disclose it to the public, even before the disclosure occurs. For instance, if a client sends a document in the mail to some third party, and it's a privileged document, the waiver occurs when the document is mailed, in a sense, because then the client has abandoned the intent to be confidential. Well, the judges, I can read cases where the judges have said the preliminary drafts aren't protected if the final version is going to be disclosed. And as politely as I can, when I talk to judges, I said, no, that's wrong. I said, it's privileged up to the time they decide that it's final. And I said, if I were to ask Your Honor, I'm much more polite than I'm talking to you here. If I were to ask Your Honors for your draft opinions, would you give them to me? No, because it's only the final version that becomes public. That's when you're okay with disclosing it. So don't take away from the corporations the right to internally draft documents with the lawyer's help and protect those up to the final version. So it's a long way of saying, Glenn, that academicians that become judges and academicians that remain academicians are the worst when it comes to privilege.
Thank you, Tom. It's been great having you here, and I know that everybody who joined us online certainly learned a great deal. If you came in late and missed any of the presentation, or you want to see it again, or you have others that might be interested in it, this will be available on our website as a full recorded version later this afternoon. I also want to note that anyone on that's interested in drug and speech regulation, we're doing a program on Monday at 1 p.m. that's also going to be webcast on the regulation of off-label speech and some of the recent developments in that area. And again, I want to thank you for joining us today, Tom, and thank everyone for being online with us.
Great. Thank you. I didn't have to put makeup on.